Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank all three witnesses for being here today. Commissioner Smith, I'd like to ask several questions. As we sit here today, Organizing for America, which is President Obama's 501c4, indeed their website is barackobama.com, they are currently, today, running online ads criticizing me. Now, Commissioner Smith, would you agree that that is their First Amendment right to do so, that should be entirely protected under the Bill of Rights?
I think it's a terrible thing to run ads criticizing you, Senator Cruz, but I probably would agree that it's protected by the First Amendment.
And that standard should obviously apply across the board, regardless of the partisan affiliation of the speaker or the person being praised or criticized.
I would apply that to criticism of Chairman Whitehouse as well, yes.
Very good. One of the things, Commissioner Smith, you talked about was the structure of the Federal Elections Commission, and in particular that you've got 3 Democrat commissioners, 3 Republican commissioners, and the role that plays as a check on partisan excesses. And you mentioned that there has been a long history when campaign activities have been located purely in the executive branch. Located in, say, the IRS, there has been a long history of abuse, and abuse on both sides of the aisle. There were allegations of abuse under President Nixon. There were allegations of abuse under President Johnson. Can you share your views on the importance of the structural check of the FEC's organization to limit either party abusing the executive branch to punish their political enemies?
Well, I mean, I think obviously it's very, very important. You know, and the history, I've outlined some of it in my prepared remarks. We see cases like the very first prosecution brought under the Federal Election Campaign Act was brought against a group of people, ordinary citizens basically, kind of upper middle class folks who had a little bit of money to pool, some professors and so on, who ran an ad in the New York Times criticizing Richard Nixon and calling for him to be impeached. This was before Watergate. And the Nixon folks said, well, if somebody's convinced we ought to be impeached, maybe they'll be convinced not to vote for me. We ought to be able to go after these folks. And so I really do think that it's very important that we, you know, long history under both parties, that's why Congress set up a bipartisan agency, not bipartisan like many agencies with a 3-2 majority or something, but a true 3-3. The Commission has historically deadlocked, as people say, gone 3-3 on about 1 to 4% of its votes. In recent years, that has spiked up to about 10% of its votes. One thing I point out is that typically resolves the issue, and it's important to note that that spike may be precisely due to the fact that over the last couple of years, we've seen, I think, strong attempts by partisans to use, you know, disclosure in the campaign finance rules in that way. You know, Media Matters has, for example, said, a very liberal group has said that its goal is to attack corporations that might make political contributions of any kind, which would include contributions to a trade association that then makes political expenditures, and then use its allies to then attack that same corporation for the damage done to its reputation, which is created by Media Matters itself. We have Candace Nichols, an opponent of Proposition 8 out in California, made the comment afterwards when that they were blacklisting and boycotting a number of folks. And as she said, years ago, they used the campaign finance regulations disclosure to get that. She said years ago we would never be able to get a blackout list that fast and quickly. Apparently this is considered progress since the McCarthy era. We're now much more efficient at creating blacklists. There's a group called Accountable America that sent letters to thousands of conservative donors threatening to dig through their lives if they continued to do that. As the New York Times reported, it was, quote, hoping to create a chilling effect that will dry up contributions. There are groups such as Huffington Post and 8 Maps that put maps to donors' homes right on the webs. What is the purpose of that? I'm straying a bit from your question, but what I'm saying is when you're in this kind of environment, it's really important that you have some degree of bipartisan support before acting.
Well, and I think the examples you gave about the potential for partisan retribution are particularly chilling. And they are most dangerous, it seems to me, for those who would have the temerity to criticize those in power. that a system that requires full disclosure of any citizen's activity in the political sphere enables those in power to very directly exact punishment for any who dare criticize them.
Well, the purpose of disclosure laws, as I've always seen them, is to inform citizens about their government, but not to inform the government about their citizens. Now, those are often two sides of the same coin, so it's hard to tease them apart. But I do think when we look at organizations that are not working with candidates, for example, that we need to start thinking about being careful about what it is that we're doing. When we're talking about direct contributions to candidates or parties, that's historically where we've allowed more disclosure, and that's where the Supreme Court upheld it in Buckley. Remember, in Buckley, the Supreme Court struck down most of the disclosure regime that otherwise existed. It was a very broad disclosure regime that would have taken in almost anybody who spoke about politics at all, whether they were giving to a candidate or not, and the court struck most of that down.
And I guess the threat of retribution for political speech, as you just described, is not hypothetical. We have seen it for donors who supported Proposition 8 in California and lost their job because they engaged in political speech. I guess we recently saw, with respect to another constitutional right in New York, a number of gun owners being publicly identified in the newspaper and potentially subject to retribution for exercising their Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. And would you agree that part of the reason the First Amendment protects the right to anonymous speech is precisely to prevent retribution for citizens engaging in speech? And indeed, that was much of the reason why perhaps the most famous example of anonymous political speech in history was the Federalist Papers, published under the pseudonym Publius.
Right. Well, as the Supreme Court said in the NAACP case that you mentioned earlier, Senator, it's hardly a novel perception that compelled disclosure of affiliation with groups engaged in advocacy may constitute an effective restraint on freedom of association. I think it's very definitely something. I've said sometimes, imagine if the government said, we're going to make sure that terrorists aren't infiltrating our government or foreigners aren't infiltrating our government. We're going to require you to report your political activity to the government, and they're going to keep it in a big database, and it will be made available to creditors, mortgage lenders, potential employers, your nosy neighbor, Halliburton, whomever wants it, right? Most people I know get very, very upset, and then I point out to them that that's exactly what the Federal Election Campaign Act does, and we're talking about doing more of it. And I want to emphasize that we already have broader disclosure in America now than we have had at any time in our nation's history. We're in the greatest disclosure age of our history, and I think when we look, we don't see that it's really achieving its goals. And I wonder if the real solution is to say we've got to have more and crack down more, or if it's really to change the idea and try to create different incentives for people to participate.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, and thank you to all of you.